Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. My name is Marlene Biener, and I am the Deputy General Counsel at the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. APA is a national association. We're located in Washington, D.C., and we serve prosecutors as well as their community partners. I'm joined today by my colleague, Frazier Kamara. She is the Director of Defender Legal Services Initiative at the National Legal Aid and Defender Association, which is a national organization that is devoted to advancing civil and criminal justice for low-income people. During today's webinar, you will be able to indicate that you have a question for our speakers by using the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbox that's located on the right side of your screen and typing out your question, and then we will go ahead and ask your question. If you have any technical assistance with today's webinar, if you're having any problems, please feel free to contact Michael Merzinski at NLADA. His email is right there on the screen. I'll give you all a minute to type it down. Okay, so both NLADA and APA are strategic allies in the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge. Some of you may not be familiar with the challenge, so I just wanted to take a moment to briefly explain what the challenge is. The Safety and Justice Challenge is providing support to local leaders from across the country who are determined to tackle one of the greatest drivers of over-incarceration in America, which is the misuse and overuse of jails. So the goal of the challenge is to rethink justice systems and implement data-driven strategies to safely reduce jail populations, with a commitment to identifying the drivers of over-incarceration within their jurisdictions and engaging a diverse set of community stakeholders to improve the system as a whole. This is also to build infrastructure to track the right data and measure performances over time. So as strategic allies in the challenge, APA and NLADA help the initiative communicate with important stakeholder groups, such as prosecutors and defense attorneys. So we are trying to provide resources and support to prosecutors and defenders' offices throughout the country and to try and assist them in implementing and sustaining their evidence-based programs. So today's webinar is called Beyond the Adversarial System, Achieving the Challenge, and it stems from a publication that APA and NLADA have jointly drafted and have recently officially rolled out. So as a result of this meeting that we hosted April of 2017, we brought together prosecutors and defenders from 4 jurisdictions across the country who are participating in the Safety and Justice Challenge to discuss how they were collaborating to achieve the goals of the challenge and implement those changes in their respective offices. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Frazier Kamara, who's going to kick things off for us by explaining a little bit more about why we did this work.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Frazier Kamara from National Legal Aid and Defender Association, and we're really excited this afternoon to host this webinar on collaboration with unlikely allies. So I want to start out by talking to you a little bit about why do we do the work. So as you just heard, both APA and NLADA serve as strategic allies in the Safety and Justice Challenge, and we are committed to ensuring that the MacArthur Foundation goals are met within the challenge. And we realized during year 1 of the challenge that the differing role that defenders and prosecutors were asked to step into of being system reform agents was very different from their traditional role. So as you can see, sitting around a policy table and looking at system-wide issues and trying to develop solutions and strategies is very different from the daily tasks that prosecutors and defenders have in protecting clients, protecting victims, and playing an adversarial role in the criminal justice system. So we realized that it was really important to do training and develop tools to help prosecutors and defenders in this new role of collaboration, which is very different from their day-to-day practice in the courtroom when they're across the aisles from each other. So Marlene, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about specifically why collaboration is important.
Thanks, April. Yeah, so we talk a lot about collaboration, and I just wanted to expand a little bit about what that means and why collaboration is important. So although today we're speaking specifically about prosecutors and defenders, sustainable change requires collaboration from all criminal justice system stakeholders. Each stakeholder has a unique position within the criminal justice system, and each system actor plays a role in creating that system change. So when all system actors work together to create that system-wide reform, the initiatives created are far more likely to be sustained. With open and honest communication, stakeholders can find common goals, and it's easier to move forward with their efforts. Problems are also identified earlier on in the situation, in the circumstances, and it's also easier to have solutions to these systemic issues that contribute to jail incarceration populations, and that can be leveraged. So when all system actors can share their own unique experiences, their own unique perspectives, what happens is those stakeholders can begin to think beyond the scope of their day-to-day individual work, and they can look towards broader criminal justice system improvements. And they can each begin to use each other as resources because each person has something different to offer. However, as we all know, it's not always easy to embrace collaboration for a plethora of different reasons, and especially when stakeholders like prosecutors and defenders are traditionally in these opposing roles, and this can sometimes create complex challenges to effective collaboration outside the courtroom. So we're going to open it up to April to ask some poll questions to you all.
Yes. So our goal today is to make this interactive. So we want to start out from hearing from our audience. We're so excited to see so many people joining us this afternoon. So we actually have a question for you. Could you share and please put it in the chat menu? And if you have a problem figuring out how to do that, feel free to send an email to Michael. But if you could enter in the chat box, what are some of the challenges that you have experienced that has prevented you from effectively collaborating with other criminal justice stakeholders? So we're going to give people a few minutes to enter that those responses in the chat box. Because we want to hear from you, and throughout the course of our presentation, hopefully we will address many of those challenges, but we wanted to open it up to the audience and get some feedback from you. So I'm going to give people a few minutes, and we will not be identifying any particular responses to individual names, so feel free to be honest and open. Because we understand that the work that we were able to do between defenders and prosecutors is very transferable to other stakeholders within the system. Specifically, many of the things that we worked on, the challenges, can be applied to other groups who may sit across from each other and be adversaries in their day jobs. And so we wanted to hear about those challenges, even outside of public defenders and prosecutors. So if people have any challenges that they want to share, feel free to enter it into the chat box.
So it looks like some people are entering into the question box instead of the chat box, which is totally okay. I'm just going to go ahead and read those aloud. So some people have said distances in rural North Dakota, failure of attorney or client to desire collaboration due to ego, different objectives or desired outcomes, definitions of justice, honoring my responsibility to client, yet working with DA. Sometimes clients think we're in collusion, and this type of collaboration can feed into that myth. Egos, jealousies, unethical conduct, and criminal behavior. inexperienced public defenders who view their job as us versus them. Hope this comment is in the right place. Usual problem is lack of cooperation from prosecutors who feel they have least reason to cooperate because they are elected officials and answer to voters and or law enforcement. Prosecutors see no need to change the system, works well for them now. Long-standing animosity and mistrust. Different agencies can be a bit territorial with their data, especially in juvenile. And prosecutors seem to believe they need to seek the most severe penalty available.
Wow, so those are some really great responses, and I really want to thank everyone for sharing those challenges. I definitely heard some themes throughout those responses, and many of those are going to be addressed today as we talk about not only keys to collaboration, but practical recommendations that came out of our work with prosecutors and defenders. So I'm going to turn it back over to Marlene to actually talk about what are some of the fundamental keys to collaboration.
So during our meeting in April of last year, when we brought together defenders and prosecutors from 4 different jurisdictions, the sites identified some very practical things that jurisdictions can do to work towards a better collaborative movement. So for example, working with a skilled facilitator can be really beneficial in breaking the tension when you have some of these really difficult conversations that just need to be had. Some of them can be personality-based, some of them can be about racial divides, but whatever it may be, the skilled facilitator can really work with those groups of people and help move that conversation forward without there being any blame. Sometimes these conversations can feel really daunting, and you might not be sure where to begin. So by using that skilled facilitator, it could be somebody who is an expert in the field, or maybe it's somebody whose sole job it is just to facilitate, and it doesn't have any stake in the criminal justice system. So having that third party come in and help establish and foster that relationship has proven very beneficial to the sites who have tried that practice. Another example of a key to collaboration is identifying system-wide goals. So when you break things down and find the lowest common denominator between the prosecutor and defender, or whoever the system actor is that you're working with, sometimes just establishing that common goal is enough to get things moving. Although it might not seem like prosecutors and defenders have a lot of the same system-wide goals, actually, when we did have these conversations and sit them down and talk about it, it does seem like there are a lot of these very common goals when you break it down. So, for example, both prosecutors and defenders do want a system that's efficient, that's fair, and that's just for all individuals. So it's also imperative to identify top priorities and understand what success looks like and how to measure it. So data is essential. It's an essential component to creating successful collaborative models between prosecutors and defenders. A lot of times when we talk about culture change, prosecutors really like to see that data. They like to see where it's stemming from and have a baseline to be able to move forward and be able to measure that success. So assessing how to collect the data, who should collect the data, as well as how to analyze that data will help serve as a guide to identify where the challenges are in the system, where the breakdowns might be in the criminal justice system, and then how to implement programs that would successfully combat those challenges and help identify top priorities and measure the success of those newly implemented programs, which is huge because that's the way we measure whether or not something is working. I just wanted to very quickly give some examples from the field and highlight 2 sites that participated in our joint meeting. They were Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and Pima County, Arizona. So in Mecklenburg County, the prosecutor and defender worked together on broader criminal justice system policies through their local criminal justice advisory group. At this meeting, key criminal justice system stakeholders and decision makers come together. They discuss issues that affect the criminal justice system. They help identify problems. They discuss potential solutions, and they create system-wide data among other goals. By having these meetings, they're able to have open communication with each other, and that ultimately makes their criminal justice system more efficient and effective and productive. But the starting point with them was they didn't assign blame. They came in and they did not point fingers. They were just very open and honest with that discussion. And sometimes just having that platform or that forum to be able to work through some of those issues can be really helpful. Another example I wanted to highlight comes from Pima County, Arizona. And in Pima County, the district attorney there and the public defense services were able to have collaboration between their offices to create multiple programs that achieved their common goals. Some of these programs included pretrial risk screenings, substance abuse and mental health screenings, and other strategies that would prevent failure to appear warrants from or resolving those, as well as post-conviction alternatives to jail, such as electronic monitoring. But the biggest point here, or the biggest example from that, is that they found those common goals, and after they did that like foundational work, they were able to move forward in creating these programs. So with that, we would like to share some recommendations from the report, and April's going to tell us a little bit about where to begin.
Great. So I know a lot of people are thinking, okay, this is a great idea, but how do you actually implement it in practice? So our underlying goal behind doing this work was really focused around practical solutions. And so what we're going to share with you today as far as our recommendations are actually recommendations that have worked on the ground in safety and justice sites who are engaging in collaborative system reform work. So these are not academic ideas. These are things that public defenders and prosecutors have actually found to proven to be valuable and effective. So I just want to share that the recommendations came from a meeting, and we heard a lot of ideas during our day together, meeting with 4 prosecutors and 4 defenders from safety and justice challenge sites. But the recommendations that you're going to hear today are the top recommendations that we thought were important enough to highlight to really get you started on doing the work. So with that being said, let's go to recommendation number 1. So the first recommendation is to set reasonable goals. So it's really important for you to come to the table with reasonable goals when engaging in collaborative work. So I can give you an example from my prior experience as a public defender. So when you go into meetings, policy meetings with diverse stakeholders, you really want to give some thought into what issues do I want to elevate that I think this particular group can address. Certain issues within the adversarial system will need to be handled within the courtroom through an adversarial process. So you should really be thinking about what policy issues could I bring to this group that could benefit not only my clients and my office, but also the system. So your goals should be aligned with, it may be a benefit to your particular office, but it should also be a benefit to the system. A very simple example would be even having access to clients at the jail. So that was one example that was given to us where the public defender was actually able to partner with the prosecutor about reducing wait times for his staff at the local jail to prepare for cases in court. And so the prosecutor specifically had an interest in helping the public defender with access issues because it improved the docket flow for the next day in court. So if the public defenders had access to clients the night before, were able to prepare for their cases, it was of a benefit to the prosecutor to actually, and to the courts, to actually improve case efficiency. So that's just one example of coming to the table with a reasonable goal that the group can address that will result in system-wide benefits. The second recommendation is to avoid blame. So you really have to switch hats and take off the adversarial role and not to point fingers at others, to really keep it objective, led by facts, and for you to identify issues with the system as opposed to issues with particular people or issues that can be very subjective in nature. So it's really important for you not to use your pointing finger at the policy reform table, but to really stay focused on objective issues that the group will be able to address. The third recommendation, one thing that we heard from each of the groups that we met with was this notion of a criminal justice coordinating council. So in many jurisdictions, it may be entitled something different. It may be a local working group. Your chief judge may pull people together for monthly meetings. We realize that in every community, the name and the title may be different. But one key recommendation that we walked away from this work knowing is that some form of a regular coordinating council, criminal justice working group meeting is really essential to collaboration because it allows you to take off the adversarial hat on a regular basis and engage in collaboration, and that is another very critical component for you to be able to do it on a regular basis, and that helps with building trust. Okay? So if we could go to recommendation number 4, enlist outside experts. So you heard Marlene talk about skilled facilitators, which is really important. And typically, many jurisdictions have that facilitation role from a local criminal justice coordinating council. And recommendation 4 is a bit different. So when we talk about outside experts, it really helps when you are about to tackle a particular issue to have someone come in from the outside who can give perhaps a national perspective of what's taking place across the country. And so we found this to be particularly helpful in discussing issues of race, which oftentimes is very difficult for people to talk about. And experts really are able to, number one, come in with great national expertise and perspective, but also they can have the conversation in a way that's not threatening to people around the table. And that's why we call them experts. So we really recommend to people to consider inviting outside experts in to have those conversations. And I know organizations like APA, NLADA, and other strategic allies, we stand ready to assist people involved in the safety and justice challenge in that way. So remember to, tap into your resources and really think about whether or not an outside group could help further the conversation in your local community around collaboration. All right, and Marlene, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about the last set of recommendations.
Awesome, thank you, April. So with recommendation number 5 on the use of data and performance measures to monitor and improve the decision-making process, I can't stress enough how important this is in working on your reform efforts, especially to prosecutors and defense attorneys. It's something that I think would help assist in culture change, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But it's also, I think, really helpful to help move those folks that might not necessarily be ready or willing to jump onto a specific initiative. So having that data, having that background and that foundation is so critical in terms of making sure that you have that kind of basis to help move your reform efforts forward. And to ensure success, prosecutors and defense offices should operate collaboratively when you're talking about creating the data, when you're talking about assessing the data and analyzing it, and who should be doing that piece of it. That should also be a piece that is operated through collaborative efforts. not only through prosecutors and defense attorneys, but you should also think about what other criminal justice system stakeholders and what other community partners should be involved in that, whether it be a researcher, an outside university, an expert, similar to what April was talking about. You should really be thinking about who else you should involve in that practice and how many other peer groups should be looking at this data and helping analyze and interpret what it means and how to best move forward with that. And then coupled with the data and the analysis aspect of it in the beginning to help figure out what challenges there are and how to move forward with those obstacles, and you'll create these programs, you'll create these initiatives to see if it would help reduce your jail population or your racial and ethnic disparity. And the way that you measure that, the way that you make sure that it's successful is through program performance measures, and ongoing oversight of those programs. And that's so necessary to make sure that you're improving your outcomes, that you're making sure that there are no glitches, or that your program is doing what you're hoping it does. So this also holds agencies accountable too. It's easy to put something, or it could be easier to put something in than it is to tweak it and to continue to massage it until you've got the right program that's really fitting the needs and the specific challenges that are occurring in your jurisdiction. And at the end of the day, what that does, as tedious as it might be, is it enhances the overall effectiveness of the entire criminal justice system. So moving on to recommendation number 6, this is about having a communication plan. This is such an important recommendation. Having a communication plan is about having an effective relationship with your media outlets. You want to show not only your positive results and have a unified response plan to get out in front of a potential crisis when something does go wrong, you also want to show those positive results. So it's sort of a twofold recommendation. It really embodies 2 in 1. So the first piece is just about the importance of positive messaging and having that established relationship with the media. So when both prosecutors and defenders, who, as we all know, are very unlikely allies, when they come out together with a unified response plan in support of a reform effort, this signals to the public and it signals to the community, those who might be affected by these programs. It shows that they can trust this new innovation. It shows that they can trust the people who are behind it. And it also raises public awareness that things are going well. So it's not just another, part of the system, another peg or a part of that cycle, but it's something that really is a new innovative method to help move people away from the criminal justice system. And it having that positive message and having that conversation with the media early on is really going to be helpful to build that trust within your community and with the public. Simultaneously with the communication recommendation is highlighting the importance of risk sharing. In the event of a potential crisis, when system actors have a unified voice and work with the media to get out in front of a crisis, the public will be better equipped to understand the overall goals of the reform and then put that potential crisis in context. So it won't take over the entire reform and swallow it whole. It'll be that piece that'll be put in context of the overall reform measure. So this response should take place well before the crisis occurs. It's really helpful to work with a media expert who should be consulted to help develop a more unified statement. So when system actors work together, they stand in solidarity. That's not lost on the public. That's not lost on the community. So they can see that, they could feel comforted by it, and they'll also know that when they stand together, they share that risk. They share the burden of that risk. So one person isn't standing alone trying to defend this program or this initiative. It'll help sustain those reforms because it won't crumble the moment that something, there is some kind of obstacle or challenge with that reform measure. So moving on to recommendation number 7, that is on culture change. So this recommendation is about committing to culture change. I talked a little bit about data earlier and how that kind of goes hand in hand with culture change. And I think the point I was trying to make there is that you have to engage all staff in your collaborative efforts. And sometimes you can engage those staff by showing those data points and showing that baseline foundation for the programs that you're trying to implement. So although policy changes often begin from the top down, from the prosecutor and the defense attorney down, sometimes the decision makers who are at the table discussing these reforms, that might not go as far if you don't include your mid-level managers and your line deputies and inform them regarding all policy changes. So communicating about those mutually agreed upon ideas when you're sitting at that table is so critical to create that lasting reform, because mid-level managers often have the most contact with those who are engaged with the day-to-day work of the system. They're the ones who touch the system. They're the ones who are in and out of it and have those individual cases. So when we start to think about culture change, we really have to ensure that there is support for change at the deputy level in addition to the mid-level management level, as well as, of course, that top level who are really the ones at the table making those policy changes, because they're really the ones who are touching those cases and they're really the ones touching the system. The eighth recommendation is about being responsive to your respective constituencies. We've mentioned earlier that traditional adversarial roles the prosecutor and the defense attorney play, they still remain in place, even though you're working on these collaborative efforts and these policy changes. That doesn't change because you're working on policy. So you're not taking off one hat to wear another hat. You're simultaneously wearing these two hats of making sure that you're working together on policy changes, but that you're also still having your traditional roles of being those adversaries in the courtroom. And I think that's something that some people might have a little bit of difficulty with. But what is important to remember is that each system actor has a unique and important part in making the criminal justice system work effectively and efficiently. And in order for prosecutors and defense attorneys to serve their constituents effectively, they need to have a recognition of the other person's ethical constraints and their requirements, and they need to really see things from the other person's perspective. So that's something that really has to be put out on the table from the get-go. It really has to be part of those initial meetings and conversations, just respecting the other person's perspective, respecting their roles, their ethical constraints, and really understanding where they're coming from, because you're going to continue to hit those hurdles and those roadblocks if you don't have that mutual respect and that general understanding from the beginning. And lastly, the last recommendation that we have from the report is recommendation number 9, which is to be intentional about building positive relationships. So fostering collegiality can really help strengthen relationships, and they can de-escalate potential tensions. So this is not only true for prosecutors and defense attorneys, right? At the end of the day, prosecutors and defenders are all people first, right? We're all humans. And so to really have these personal relationships fostered, it's really important to kind of try to strengthen those relationships by fostering that collegiality. So, for example, we've heard stories of prosecutors and defenders who have been able to establish those personal relationships because they went to law school together, or because their kids played on the same sports teams and they were able to have that outside perspective. So when they entered into that those particular roles, they were able to enter into it with that trust already built in. So if there isn't something organic like that, sometimes just finding a moment to have a cup of coffee together or going to lunch together, that will go really far in helping establish those personal relationships. And when you start to build on that, trust is developed. And when trust is developed, prosecutors and defenders can begin to have that collaborative partnership where sustainable long-term change is created. So those are the recommendations from the report. And I'm going to turn it over to April to talk about some solutions to common challenges.
Great. Thanks, Marlene. So actually now we want to shift to talk about how our recommendations actually are solution-oriented. So at the beginning of the webinar, we heard the different challenges that people face in their jurisdictions in engaging in collaboration. So actually at the top of the list, lack of trust is one that we hear often. And particularly the issue of trust is really important because when you engage in system-wide reform and collaboration, there will be things along the way that you learn and things that you get wrong and things that you have to improve along the way. And it's very important for people around the table to actually trust each other in engaging in the process. So one recommendation that we have is to really lay ground rules. So many of the groups that we talked to, they talked about how the facilitator of the meetings really laid out very open ground rules of communications. Some groups talked about how there was an agreement about sharing data with each other, whether or not that information would stay in the room. There was also some agreement about, in order to foster open communication, to keep the comments and conversations around the table internally to that group. And they also had the rule of avoiding blame, not to take any personal shots at each other or to point fingers. But a skilled facilitator will know and understand how important it is for you to have baseline rules of engagement. And though that is one of the primary and fundamental ways for you to overcome the issue of lack of trust. So I hope that that's very helpful to people as well. The next thing that we heard specifically from prosecutors and defenders was this whole public perception. And I heard it in one of the responses from our audience about this whole issue of whether or not I'm betraying my client's confidence in me by partnering with the prosecutor, and this whole notion of prosecutors appearing weak on crime or not consistent with their role of being a law enforcement officer. And the thing about public perception is that it really is important for your working group to have a mission statement or a public statement about specifically the work that they're doing. So the MacArthur Project is a great example of that. So anytime a stakeholder within the challenge is challenged about what their role is from the public, you can point back to the goals of the MacArthur Safety and Justice Challenge. So I'm engaged in this work because I'm committed to reducing jail populations and rethinking the way that we use our jails. And I'm also committed to reducing racial disparities. So that statement alone is an example of how you can have a mission statement to help you shift and respond to public perception, but also to highlight the fact that collaboration is really about a problem-solving framework. So regardless of what your traditional role is, every system actor should be committed to improving the criminal justice system, and we all have our own individual motivations for wanting the system to work well. But ultimately, the idea of working to strengthen and solve the problems within the criminal justice system should be one that resonates with the public. Another challenge that oftentimes that we hear is one about culture change. So as we all know, many of the actors who are involved in SJC meetings may be in executive roles or high-level management. And in order for you to implement the policy changes and ideas that you work on in a collaborative model, you have to have the ability to get your line staff to buy into what you're doing. And so it's really important for you to engage all of your staff in the collaborative efforts, to keep them updated, to let them know why you're going to meetings, to let them know why you are spending so much time on a particular project, but also to translate it and help them to understand how is it going to improve their daily jobs. by the work that you're doing in the collaborative working groups. So communication with line staff is really a key solution to addressing the challenge of culture change. And finally, one challenge that people identified was really trying to figure out a way to involve community members. How do you, a lot of criminal justice coordinating councils have realized that the value of inviting the community in to be a part of those stakeholder groups. But the way to deal with that is to actually be responsive and don't shy away from opportunities to engage the communities that you serve. And to listen, because oftentimes the solutions that we're looking for are already known by people who have either experienced the criminal justice system or who have had family members and other people impacted by the system. So be responsive to the community. And with that, we are going to open it up to questions. So please, if possible, we'll find your questions in either box, but if you enter it into the chat menu, we can read those off. So we're going to give people a few minutes. We're going to give people a few seconds to ask your questions. We're really excited to hear from you and to engage you around any questions you have about what we discussed today.
Yes, so before, when we were talking a little bit about the challenges, we did have one or two additional comments that came in after the segment. So somebody did ask if we could talk about who was invited to the local criminal justice group in North Carolina. And so I was very quickly able to pull that up. And it looks like there are a great number of different committee members that are present as part of that. So they are everyone from district court judges and magistrates, child support enforcement directors, clerks of the court, community support service directors, county managers designee, city managers designee, the district attorney, health department, chief of judicial district manager, police chief, a lot of different police, the public defender, senior resident of the Superior Court judge, the sheriff, as well as the trial court administrator. I don't want to speak for the committee. This was just based on what we discussed a little bit at the meeting. So I think that they do have a public information website. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, I can get that to you after the webinar. We also received one additional comment regarding a person who is presenting at NAPD in Denver this month, and they would like the Divo, which is, I believe, the Defense Initiated Victim Outreach, to be connected with the Beyond the Adversarial System. So we did receive your suggestion, and we will reach out to you as well after the webinar. So we received another question. What are resources for outside experts or facilitators?
So that's a really great question. So if you are involved in it really depends on what work you're working on. So if you're involved in the Safety and Justice Challenge, of course, you can reach out to your site coordinators and ask them about different skill facilitators to come in. One example would be, so through our work as a strategic ally, we do an annual Defender Leadership Summit. And I invited the Burns Institute in to train defenders on the issue of race and community engagement. So that's one example of me reaching out to a skill facilitator in an area where we didn't have in-house expertise to conduct a training for defenders on race and community engagement. Many national organizations have some limited budget to whatever work that they're working on. They are a part of their responsibility is to really disseminate it out to the field. So when you reach out, you can ask them whether or not they have a travel budget to come and talk to your group, but also be creative. Now you have technology. So you may have a meeting where you Skype a expert in to give a presentation on a particular topic. So be creative, use technology, reach out to national organizations who offer expertise. It really just depends on what your topic is. But you will be surprised how many national organizations would be willing to come in and do work with your jurisdiction.
Thanks, April. And then just one additional quick piece there is the county might have some facilitators that they typically work with for other meetings. So reaching out to the county to see if they have anybody they recommend that might not be an expert necessarily, but they would have that non-biased kind of perspective. That was what some of the sites that we spoke with have used. Okay, so the next question is, often the regular prosecutors and probably defenders are easier to work with than the leaders of associations. Do you recommend bypassing the leaders to accomplish progress in collaboration, or is this counterproductive in the long run?
So it really depends. I think in order for you to have effective, sustainable reform, you have to engage all players at all parts of the system ultimately. But I think you have to really look at your particular culture and jurisdiction to figure out where to start. So if you start with line or mid-level staff people to start doing the work, I've seen it done both ways. I've seen very effective working groups of line defenders and prosecutors come together to research a particular issue and gather the data and then present it to leadership who had no other choice but to buy in because it was so effectively done. I've also seen it in the reverse where leadership has a particular issue and they really do the work and present it to people who are doing the day-to-day work in their office. I don't think it's a way for you to avoid particular stakeholders because ultimately those people will play some role in the success of your reform. And also, when you talk about policy changes, a lot of what we found with the projects that you see highlighted in our report, there was not any particular legislation that was changed. People just changed their actual practice. So when you talk about changing practices and local policies, you really need leadership to be able to impact that area. Marlene, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so just one additional piece, because we have heard a little bit that what we've heard is that sometimes it could be difficult to work with some prosecutors and sometimes defenders who are at the top level. And so something that we've found is just that there is a particular issue, and instead of kind of handling that and trying to work through that, it could be a little bit easier to circumvent it. My suggestion is to just try and see if you could work through it. A lot of times it's something that can be really simple. For example, if it's a piece of legislation, it could just be just a specific provision that someone at the top level cannot feel comfortable supporting. So sometimes it's just getting a handle on what the exact issue is, really breaking that down, and then after that point, you'll be able to really see if like what April said, sometimes it makes more sense to have it from that ground level, and other times it could be easier to work with the top. So, but sometimes just really stemming and figuring out the root cause of why it's more difficult to work with that person could be really, really helpful. Okay, so we've got a few more questions. We're going to try and get to all of them. But if we don't get to them, we will reach out to you after the webinar, and we will make sure to respond to every person. Okay. So if you have a line person who is responsible for implementing and they act autonomously and top level are intimidated by a line person, how do you encourage executives to act?
So that's a great question. I think it goes back to the culture change issue that the need for a shift in culture. So this is, this is really an honest reality about attorneys, period. I think change is hard for a lot of groups, but I've noticed in doing systems reform work, change is very difficult for most attorneys, period, because we're trained to perfect a particular area of practice. And so people oftentimes, when they feel like their particular job, they're doing it well, they don't often see the need for system-wide change. So I think a part of it is having a conversation with the line staff about how their daily practice impacts a system-wide issue. And really trying to unpack the different role that we have to play. Of course, you have to do your daily practice, but also what responsibility do we have to improve the system overall? So I think one way to overcome challenges with leadership and whether people are intimidated by each other is to have questions and to have open communication, but also for leaders to be very honest in accepting the fact that they may not understand what's happening on a daily basis on the ground. Many leaders don't have the opportunity to have a caseload, so they may be removed from the daily practice. So they should really be humble and listen to the challenges and concern of line staff, because it may be different from when they were in the courtroom 3, 5, 10 years ago. So I think open communication on both sides, but also to get people to understand how their daily work impacts the larger goals of justice and fairness and efficiency for the system.
And I just have two quick things to add to that. I totally agree with everything that April said. So one thing is, for example, in Mecklenburg, North Carolina, they have multiple internal meetings, as I'm sure so many of your offices do as well. But they make sure that at least once a month that they have, I believe it's once a month, they have the district attorney sit down with those line deputies and really talk about what's going on. So that's something that can be established, especially if you have a little bit of a smaller office, just to really have that conversation, that open communication about what's going on in that line deputy's world and what's going on the policy side. The other piece that I wanted to mention is having a concrete and very visible mission statement for your entire office. That's an internal mission statement. So when those line deputies go to work each day, and that's something that's very, that's given to them, that's something that they understand, and that's something that they know they need to be doing their job, adhering to that specific mission statement. And it could be a mission statement that takes the ideas that we're talking about today and really implements them into that, so that they know that as soon as they're going to work, and it could be a wider spread one. It doesn't have to isolate or single out that specific line deputy, but something that we have seen effective in specific jurisdictions is when they have that mission, they give it to their line deputies and they say that this is, what you need to adhere to be part of this office. And we have found that to be a really helpful thing that some jurisdictions have done. Okay. Is this type of collaboration most effective when it develops organically, or can it still be effective if pushed from the outside? And how is this funded?
That's a really great question. So the really good news is that I feel like we had an even split, wouldn't you say, Marlene, between people at the table who had organic collaborations versus people who were brought together around a particular funded project. So we really had different offices who had different years of experience with each other, and some of them happen organically. Like Marlene stated, some people went to law school together and just ended up on different aisles, different sides of the aisle. Some people had, kind of personal relationships through living in the same community. So we're confident that it can happen both ways. And whether it's orchestrated or mandated through a particular process, or whether or not it just happens naturally. So I think it can happen naturally. As far as funding to support it, we do find that a key common denominator is some particular either office or group that's responsible for pulling together the group on a regular basis. And it typically happens where it's most effective when the person, like if it's a criminal justice coordinating council who is neutral, and someone who's not is not brought together by, let's just say, the public defender's office or the prosecutor's office, but it's an independent entity, someone outside of the adversarial system who brings people together. But they're also able to keep the ball moving in between meetings, because the people at the table will go back to their day jobs, and really this is not the top priority. So funding or some kind of committed staff to keep the convenings happening on a regular basis and to keep the work moving, I think is very important.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, April. And there's actually a follow-up question to that, which is, will this collaboration outlive the MacArthur challenge, and what happens when the challenge is over? So I totally think that goes right with what you were just saying. And I think that's really the importance of this culture change, and having it be the line deputies, the mid-level managers, and everyone in between, really having it be the concrete mission of the office, to make sure that this is something that is sustainable, and that also goes back to the risk sharing, because if there are hiccups, it's really easy for some of these programs to not necessarily make it once that funding is over. But when you can show that these programs are working, that the data is there, that the performance measures are there, that you could really see that it's successful, that it's really changing these over incarcerated populations, and that it's really reducing racial and ethnic disparities. When you really can show that, I think that's where, and when you could show that solidarity, I think that's where you can go to your county, you can go to those other individuals and really try and get that funding to sustain your programs. And someone just made a quick comment, important really to identify those on both sides who play well with others and let them take the lead. I think that's a really good point, just the point of finding or pinpointing those champions in your office, and just really making sure to highlight the work that they're doing and the fact that they could do something like that. And then, sorry, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead if you want to read another comment.
So I was just going to say there are about 2 to 3 more comments. They're not necessarily questions, but they're comments. So they're more so about just getting additional resources and a little bit more of an explanation of how overpopulation of jails can stymie the criminal justice system. I don't think that we're going to have time to get to those today, but we're definitely going to reach out to you after the webinar and make sure to have those additional conversations with you. Anything else you want to say, April, before we wrap up?
No, I want to thank everyone for taking time. I know everyone is very busy, so thank you for joining us today. And please look out. We are going to continue this conversation, because our goal is that we know if we can get prosecutors and defenders to play well in the sandbox, that this information and recommendations are definitely transferable to other groups. So please continue to look out for training opportunities and conversations that we intend to continue around the issue of achieving the challenge beyond the adversarial system.
Thank you, April, and I completely agree. I do just want to thank everybody who called in today and who participated in this really important discussion. Like April said, we're definitely going to be continuing that, so look out for it. As I mentioned a little earlier, our report is out. If you'd like more information on what we discussed today and about this subject, you can find it on our website, apainc.org, as well as NLADA's website. And I'll go ahead and put that on the screen. If you have any questions or concerns, you can please feel free to email us at webinars@apainc.org, or you see my email address as well as April's email address on the screen. Also, today's discussion is recorded, so if you want to see it in the future, you can. It will be made available to the public. So thank you for attending with us today, and have a really great day.